Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday morning. I'm getting your update for Chapter 5. Good job on last week's assignments. And right now, as of this morning, many of you, there's still a couple that are kind of a little bit behind on there. So try to make sure you get on there this morning, this afternoon early, and that way you have some time to get those completed. And then finish up the last week's assignments. So right now I want to go ahead and talk. So there's no discussion board for Chapter 5. I think you've got plenty of things to do. So you'll need to look over this video and look over the PowerPoint. We'll talk about it during this video. And then go ahead and take the Chapter 5 quiz. The assignments this week we'll talk about, but there's the interview family member of someone who's been on an IEP and ask some questions, and then go ahead and get that interview turned in by Sunday night. Then Sunday night you'll also have the test over 4, 5, 9, and 13. We'll do an evaluation activity in class on Tuesday, and we'll also discuss the Vineland that we didn't get to last week. Then I'll discuss the IEP for a learning disability. We would just go over and kind of get you some ideas of what you probably want to look at and then go from there. We'll also discuss the IEP, the strategies for an LD assignment, and that'll be it. So let's go ahead and look at Chapter 5. We go ahead and enlarge this over here and take these off. Okay, as we're looking on here, I want you to go ahead, first thing you ought to do is go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint, and then go ahead, this on here I have two different YouTube videos that I want you to watch. Better idea of students' YouTube video, and then when you get done watching that, come back to this video here that we're on. Okay, let's go ahead. You've seen the video now. So you need to look at the 3 criteria that most states utilized for learning disabilities. You'll also want to look at the characteristics that encompass students with learning disabilities, and explain the possible reasons for the recent decline in those number of students that are identified, and then identify 3 suspected causes of learning disabilities. The next few are describe assessments and used to identify teaching, reading, writing, and math to students with learning disabilities, and then compare and contrast typical placements for supports for these students that have learning disabilities. Now what I want you to do is look at the next YouTube video, My Life with a Learning Disability. It takes you through the life of a student or a child with a learning disability and okay, let's go ahead and go on to the next one. IDEA definitions: a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language that are spoken or written. It may manifest itself with disabilities, brain injuries, minimum brain dysfunction, and dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Does not include learning problems that are the result of other disabilities or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. And so those are the IDEA definitions. Let's go into those a little bit more. Specifically, need to get down the bottom here. It does not include intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, cultural factors, environmental, economic disadvantages, or limited English proficiency. So you'll see that the DESE definition that we have to follow through as teachers in the state of Missouri, the first part of those other factors, then they would not be considered as a learning disabled student. They would be considered in those other categories. So then on this one here, it has a specific learning disability when the child does not achieve adequately for the child in one or more of the following areas when provided with a learning experience and instruction appropriate for the child's age or state approved grade level standards. And if you look down there, there's oral expression, listening comprehension, written skills, written expressions, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comp, math calculation, math problem solving, And then there's also the added part B. The child does not make sufficient progress on those and above using process-based on child's response to scientific research-based interventions. It should sound very familiar to the ID definition. Or the child exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance, achievement, or both relative to age, state-approved grade level standards, or intellectual development that is determined by the group to be relevant. A pattern of strengths and weaknesses is defined as severe discrepancy between than that. Thus, the IQ is not going to go down as far. It was basically from that 70 above is what you're going to be looking at for a learning disability. Also, there's the part C, a visual, hearing, or motor disability. ID, it can't be any part of these. Limited English proficiency, lack of appropriate instruction, lack of appropriate instruction in math, in reading, and to ensure that underachievement of a child suspected of having an SLD or specific learning disability is not due to the lack of appropriate instruction, the group must consider the following. Data that demonstrates that prior to or as part of the referral process, the child was provided appropriate instruction in regular education settings delivered by qualified personnel. So you're going to look at the past history of the student to make sure that they were in school most of the time. If a student is not attending school, they're not going to get the instruction, which means that it is because of that lack of instruction, not necessarily because they have a learning disability. So you're going to get a past history by looking at the student's records at your school, or if they are normally, at least when I was process coordinator a few years back, it was 1 or 2 points is what we would look at. If it was more than 1 or 2 points away, then it was not considered professional judgment, and the district did not want you really to use professional judgment. If a responsible agency uses severe discrepancy method, a child who does not display a discrepancy of at least criteria of this rule, and based upon professional judgment, the review of formal and informal assessments, the evaluation team continues that severe discrepancy exists. In such cases, sufficient data must be presented in the evaluation report to document. In other words, if you're not able to use some of the assessments you got, it does not show at least a 1.5 standard deviation, provide documentation that you're going to put in the evaluation as to why you deem the student as a student with a learning disability. So that's basically what that is saying. There's one more part. Any agency using response to intervention model for the identification of SLD must have written procedures for implementation that which are found on the department's website. So in other words, if you're using response to intervention, which is also discussed in this document, you must also provide their procedures and documentation of what you have gone through to deem the student, again, a specific learning disability in a certain area or multiple areas. The NJCLD definition, it talks about that in the book too. You'll have inclusion of obsolete terms, includes terms that are difficult to define, and the wording of the exclusion clause suggests that learning disabilities cannot occur with other disabilities. Then there's response to intervention. A local education agency may use a process that determines if the child responds to scientific, research-based intervention as part FAIL model to one of early identification and prevention. And what they're meaning by that wait to fail, is typically the time involved. For the teacher or the parent, again, the parent can refer their student to as a student with a disability also. In addition to, the teacher can talk to but in that case there, you then talk about it, then you get together a document that shows the referral process and what you utilize in gaining the information, the history and all of that in a meeting. You discuss the information that you have and present it to the team along with an evaluation. The evaluation then takes 60 days, and then after that you have then another 30 days to develop an IEP off of that evaluation. So it can be a couple of months before determining if a student has a daily basis to see where the students lie. And if they don't If they feel like they are not living up to that criteria that that district makes for a student to be learning in that environment, then they will have some small group instruction in addition to. Don't continue to do well after a certain amount of attempts, then they may then go to that third tier, which is normally then referral to special education. So I guess in layman's terms what they're saying is during the response to intervention, the teacher is constantly looking at whether that wait to fail shows up. Intelligence and achievement tests, they measure the discrepancy between achievement and general intellectual ability. And then there's also curriculum-based measurement, measures the growth of a student's proficiency in the core skills, monitors progress. Much of this is done on both sides, whether you're going by the response to intervention or you're using the discrepancy model. Now, the discrepancy model is what most school districts that I've worked with at. If it's 100, then what that school will be looking for, if they have a learning disability, would be a 22-point discrepancy between that IQ and those achievement scores. So if they have 100 IQ, which is average, and their IQ might have a learning disability in writing, and reading would be the same thing, a 78 or below, then they might have a reading disability in that area too. So that's basically what the discrepancy, and like I say, we will discuss hot. You're going to have precision teaching, criterion reference tests, and then used to compare a score with a predetermined criterion. So that's, looking at what they do each day, comparing it to where you want them to be, and then going from there, either reteaching or something. Achieving students' response to increasingly intensive, scientifically validated instruction can reveal whether the student's learning difficulties are the result of poor or insufficient instruction or a need of disability for which special education is needed. So you have that tier 1, which is a primary intervention that's all in the general education classroom, and all students are in there. Then you go to that second, direct instruction, using maybe some different strategy methods to help them achieve what you're wanting them to do on certain assignments or certain skills. If they are able to do that, then they would be moved back to the regular education classroom, continue on in the class, continue on, fine, then yes, they can be moved back into that regular education classroom. That can happen multiple times. But let's say they're in that second tier and they're still not getting it, then they would go then to that tier 3. And that's normally after certain weeks of strategies. It's not just like hey, you're in there for a day or two and then you go to tier 3. Typically, that's not going to be the case. And typically that third. So I'm trying to make sure. There we go. It looks like we're still on target. Benefits of RTI. These are some of the benefits that the text is given. Early intervention, or earlier intervention, I guess I should say, for struggling learners. Reduction in the number of students referred to special education. I had an IEP that I was looking through, and initially they would come into special education with not really an academic type of a concern, but more of they didn't do homework or something of that nature. And then all of a sudden they're in special education off of professional judgment, which is why right now I'm glad that most schools do not do a lot of professional differentiated instruction that we talked about last week. They need that. Not all of us learn the same way. I don't learn the same way as you, and you won't learn the same way as another person in this class. So how should we expect our students to be any different? Provision of more instructionally useful data. So it can help the teachers in general also. They're able to look at the data. Service to all students with achievement problems. Only those who fail to respond to multiple levels of intervention are diagnosed with LD. So that's the benefits. Some concerns. There's inconsistent criteria for determining whether or not a student is responding to intervention. Weak and ineffective Tier 1 instruction and some resulting in students without LD inaccurately identified as at risk. And this is where school districts just need to make sure that they're getting high quality instruction in the classroom. So many times teachers will be monitored also in their classroom on their instructional strategies. And they're going to be watched by administration to see how many kids are being directed into this second tier of application of the RTI across schools. RTI is done by many schools, but they are so different that there might be some schools that really don't utilize it as well as they should be. Prevalence talks about that in the textbook, and LD is by far the largest of all special education category. This figure represents about 37% of all school-age children and about 5% of the total school-age population. Percentage varies among states. Some contend that too many low achievers have been improperly diagnosed as LD, because as I mentioned last week, special education student that is a special needs student. So in most cases, LD is unknown. Brain damage or dysfunction. Let me go back there. Heredity. There's growing evidence that genetics may account for at least some family links with reading disabilities. And environmental factors, impoverished instruction received, are all possible causes of that. The next slide is one I left in there. I'd like for you to kind of stop and answer the question, why is the concept of learning disabilities proven so difficult to define? Think about that for a few seconds and maybe write that down on a piece of paper. And if you don't know, go back in the book and look and see what you can find out, because I think you will be enlightened by what you find. And then what characteristics. Okay, I'm hoping this video is going okay. It looks like there's times when it's kind of freezing. I'll get done with it here in a few minutes and check. And may have to restart it. Characteristics: poor social skills. 75% have deficits in poor. Behavioral problems, higher than usual incidence of behavioral problems. And it's unclear, the book talks about unclear whether academic deficits or the behavior problems cause the other difficulty, or whether both are products of other causal factors. And lower levels of self-esteem or self-efficacy, mood, effort, and hope. And I think we can probably, many students, achievement despite general effective instruction and intelligence in the normal range. The difference between what students with learning disabilities are expected to do in the 7th grade to the high school, you will start to see that gap widens significantly in there. So trying to make sure that you're watching that, you're changing your instruction to be the best. Reading problems. This can go back to one of those questions I just asked. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. Severe difficulties with phonological and phonemic awareness includes impairment in comprehension because of the inability to rapidly read words. That's why they like to have students work on fluency and making connections to prior knowledge or understanding text structure. Those students that don't trying to connect it with prior knowledge can help with their memory, can help with the working memory, can help them better understand. And so if they have deficits in that, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for you as a teacher to get them to learn that. Written language. Deficits of written language perform lower than their age-matched peers without disabilities. Difficulty communicating ideas through writing very well for you to understand what exactly that student has learned and what they still need help with. They seldom use self-regulation strategies, and they produce poorly organized compositions containing a few underdeveloped. Math. Numerical reasoning and calculation pose major problems and perform lower than typically achieving students on every type of math problem across the grades. Deficits in retrieving number facts. And at middle school, the math performance of 44% of students with learning disabilities is comparable to students 3 or more grade levels. So you can see how from early grades, first, second, or third, until even just the 5th grade, mediated scaffolding, strategic integration, primed background knowledge, judicious review. I'd look over those so you have a general understanding of what they are. Reading. Some general education approaches have poor comprehension due to failure to read strategically. Explicit instruction of learning strategies is effective for teaching reading comprehension. Use technology tools like word prediction and speech-to-text software. I know I've had a couple students that I've taught that have used Talk-Into, because again, it's just getting it from here down to paper to really understand what that student is saying. So one idea that I've heard over times is have the student read a comic book or read a newspaper or just read the textbook into into that document. Use items like Grammarly. Grammarly I use also, and my students, I suggest to utilize it too. It works in many different software programs, so it can help the student with that. In math, at explicit instruction again, there's you can get a benefit both ways by using their peers to help teach students. Not only do the peers learn better, but then the student works better. And teach learning strategies and problem-solving skills. Content enhancements are used to enhance the organization, like graphic organizers, visual displays, note-taking teaching strategies like guided notes, mnemonics, the letter strategies, the keyword method, the PEG. For explicit instruction, I'd look at 166 through 168. Sorry, my dog is starting to want to come in. We only have a few slides left, though. There's placement options we want to consider. General education, and then go for maybe just some resource time for that resource teacher to go through that lesson a little more to make sure and give them some strategies and give them some more assistance. Better help the students that are in those classes. Then there's the resource room, a specially staffed and equipped classroom where students with LD come for one or more or several periods during the school day to receive individualized instruction based on what their needs are. Special ed teacher is responsible for all education programming for 8 to 12 students with learning disabilities. That means that special ed teacher is giving their instruction, their classroom, all of their instruction in writing for that student, and they may be fine in reading and math, or it could be math and they're fine in writing and reading. So make sure you remember that. Students should be placed in separate classrooms only after legitimate and supported attempts to serve effectively in those less restrictive environments. Remember, LRE, least restrictive environment. You're going to start up in the classroom and gradually work your way out. This would be one of the last options the team would consider. Go ahead and give more information then. So anyway, I'll see you Tuesday. Good luck on the rest of your assignment for today, it being Sunday, and I will look over that on Monday morning.